Connie Dabate lived in a world that many would have described as comfortable, perhaps even enviable. The small town she called home was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where children played freely on front lawns, and where the rhythm of life rarely changed. For years, she had built a reputation as someone dependable and warm, a woman who cared deeply for her family and stayed loyal to her friends. Those who knew her would often speak of her laugh, the kind that could fill a room, and her ability to listen with genuine interest. She was the kind of person others leaned on when life became too heavy. To outsiders, her marriage to Richard looked steady and reliable. Together, they projected an image of stability, a couple who had weathered life's storms and come out stronger. Beneath this polished surface, however, the reality was far less perfect. Connie carried silent worries that she rarely voiced. Bills piled up in ways that weighed heavily on her, and Richard's choices often left her unsettled. There were moments when she sensed something slipping away between them, a growing distance she could not quite name but could certainly feel. Friends noticed subtle changes in her demeanor, times when she appeared distracted during gatherings or smiled a little less brightly than before. She was present, but her spirit sometimes seemed miles away. Richard, for his part, cultivated an outward charm. He was involved in community events and always quick to greet neighbors with a handshake or a story. Many saw him as a man devoted to his household, working hard to provide for the life he and Connie had built together. Yet those who observed more closely caught hints of strain. He seemed restless at times, distracted by thoughts he never voiced, carrying secrets he guarded carefully. His desire to appear flawless often masked the turbulence underneath. Their home reflected both comfort and tension. The walls carried the warmth of photographs, family memories, and holiday traditions. Yet in certain corners lingered an unspoken unease, the kind that creeps in when two people drift apart without acknowledging it aloud. Connie held on to the life she had worked for, determined to preserve stability, but she also recognized that cracks were forming in the foundation. Trust, once unshakable, began to erode. Despite these struggles, Connie remained deeply rooted in her routines. She worked diligently, kept in touch with her family, and offered kindness to those around her. She was not someone who allowed hardship to define her. She was resilient. Her strength lay in her ability to carry burdens without letting them spill into the lives of those she loved. But resilience has its limits, and Connie's ability to manage everything silently only added to the pressure building behind closed doors. What no one could see was how the tension between her and Richard would grow into something far darker than a strained marriage. To neighbors, they were just another couple navigating the ups and downs of life in suburbia. Yet within the quiet streets and familiar routines, a betrayal was taking shape, hidden carefully until the day it would finally explode into tragedy. Connie's story began in the ordinary, in the everyday rhythms of suburban life, but it would end in a way no one in her circle could have imagined. December 23rd began like any other day in the Dabate household, with no sign that it would soon be remembered for tragedy. The streets outside were calm, the air crisp with winter cold, and neighbors went about their routines, unaware that events were about to unfold that would shake the entire community. Connie moved through her morning in her usual steady way, preparing for the holiday season that was only days away. There was no indication in her actions that danger lingered so close, no warning of the violence that would soon consume her home. The day carried the quiet energy of anticipation, the kind that comes before family gatherings and celebrations. Yet beneath this surface, something darker was already in motion. Later that morning, emergency services received a frantic call from Richard. His voice carried panic as he claimed that an intruder had broken into their home, attacked his wife, and left him bound and injured. Responders rushed to the address, prepared for the chaos that comes with violent crime. When they arrived, the scene inside the house was chilling. Connie lay on the floor, unresponsive, her life already gone. Richard, tied loosely to a chair, bore injuries that appeared shallow compared to the horror surrounding him. The stark contrast between their conditions immediately raised questions, though no one voiced them in the urgency of the moment. Richard told investigators a story of terror. He described a masked figure forcing entry into the home, a struggle, and then a brutal attack on Connie. He claimed he had been overpowered, restrained, and left helpless as his wife's life was taken. The story, at first glance, was the kind that fit neatly into the narrative of random violence, the type of crime that sends shockwaves through quiet neighborhoods because it feels both senseless and unstoppable. Friends and neighbors, when they heard the news, reacted with disbelief. How could such horror find its way into their peaceful corner of Connecticut? The initial hours after Connie's death were filled with confusion and sympathy. Many assumed Richard's account was true, that he too had been a victim of the same cruel fate. He was seen as the surviving husband left with scars from a terrifying ordeal. Officers moved through the house collecting evidence, documenting the scene, and listening carefully as Richard recounted what had happened. His words painted a vivid picture of violence, fear, and survival, a narrative that placed him at the center of a tragedy he claimed he could not prevent. Yet even in those first moments, small details seemed out of place. The bindings that held Richard appeared unusual, almost as if they had been tied with little effort. Items scattered around the home suggested disturbance, but not the kind of frantic chaos one might expect from a sudden break-in. Despite these observations, the focus remained on the loss of Connie, a woman whose life had been cut short only days before Christmas. The tragedy seemed too raw, too painful for suspicion to take root immediately. As word spread through the community, the image of an intruder breaking into the Dabate home took hold. People locked their doors a little tighter and looked over their shoulders with new caution. Fear seeped into the town, as it often does when the possibility of random violence is introduced. But behind the scenes, investigators were already taking note of the inconsistencies. While Richard's story offered an explanation for Connie's death, the evidence waiting to be uncovered would soon tell a far different tale. As detectives began to examine the events of that December morning, they quickly realized that the details Richard had given them were not as solid as they first appeared. The more they asked him to retell the story, the more inconsistencies crept in. Sometimes the intruder was described as tall, other times average height. The order of events shifted slightly each time, leaving investigators uneasy. It was not unusual for trauma to cloud a survivor's memory, but in this case, the gaps felt too deliberate, as though the story was being adjusted rather than recalled. The crime scene itself raised further suspicion. Richard had insisted the intruder created chaos throughout the home, yet officers found that most items were in place. A few objects appeared knocked over, but they looked staged, too neatly disturbed to match the struggle he described. The bindings on Richard's wrists and ankles were especially troubling. Financial troubles added yet another layer. Records showed mounting debt, insurance policies, and the heavy weight of obligations that Richard could not easily manage. Investigators saw how the pieces fit together: a man in debt, an affair he wanted to legitimize, and the looming responsibilities of a marriage he no longer valued. Taken together, these factors transformed the narrative. The death of Connie Dabate was no longer framed as a random act of violence, but as a calculated choice born of selfishness and desperation. Friends and family were stunned as these revelations came to light. To them, Connie had always been a woman deeply rooted in her community, a person who had shown loyalty and compassion. The idea that her life had been cut short not by chance but by someone she trusted most was... Every text message and every digital trace drew investigators further into the reality of betrayal. Forensic analysis backed these suspicions. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, no fingerprints belonging to a stranger, and no stolen items that would suggest robbery. Everything pointed inward, toward Richard. The intruder story that once seemed plausible was now falling apart completely. Instead, investigators saw a man who had meticulously planned to rid himself of the life he no longer wanted, crafting a tale of survival to mask his guilt. By this stage of the investigation, Richard was no longer viewed as a grieving husband, but as the primary suspect in a crime that shocked everyone who knew the couple. The facade he had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling under the weight of his own secrets. What had once seemed like a tragic twist of fate was now becoming clear as a deliberate act of betrayal, exposing a darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. Piece by piece, investigators assembled the puzzle that revealed the truth behind Connie's death. What began as fragments of doubt evolved into a full narrative of betrayal and deception. Digital records were among the most damning evidence. Connie's smartwatch showed she was alive and active long after Richard claimed she had been attacked. making his timeline impossible. Cell phone records placed him in areas he insisted he had not been, and computer logs suggested careful planning before the day of the crime. Each discovery chipped away at the fragile facade he had tried to maintain. Financial documents added weight to the case. Insurance policies naming Richard as the beneficiary stood out, particularly given the mounting debt the couple faced. To investigators, it was impossible to ignore the timing. The prospect of financial relief through tragedy aligned too neatly with the other motives uncovered, including his affair. The story of a masked intruder no longer held even a trace of credibility. Instead, the evidence showed calculation, premeditation, and an attempt to disguise murder as a random act of violence. When prosecutors presented the findings, the case transformed into something much larger than a local tragedy. The courtroom became the stage where the betrayal was laid bare for everyone to see. Jurors listened as digital experts walked them through the data, showing how every movement, every message, and every inconsistency pointed to Richard. Friends and neighbors who had once pitied him now saw the truth, their sympathy replaced with disbelief and anger. The image of a man fighting to protect his wife had collapsed, revealing someone willing to sacrifice her life for his own selfish desires. The affair played a central role in the proceedings. Messages between Richard and his mistress showed a vision of a future without Connie. They revealed not only a man unhappy in his marriage, but someone determined to erase the obstacles standing in the way of the life he wanted. His mistress testified, confirming details that stripped away the last remnants of his defense. To the jury, it became clear that this was not a man caught in tragic circumstances, but one who had created them. The betrayal extended far beyond the crime itself. For Connie's family, the pain of losing her was compounded by the knowledge that the person responsible was the one she trusted most. They listened as the story of deception unfolded, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. What had once seemed like a happy marriage was revealed as a lie carefully maintained until the moment Richard decided it no longer served him. The betrayal was not only of Connie, but of everyone who had believed in the life they shared. When the verdict was finally delivered, it confirmed what investigators had known for months. Richard had orchestrated the crime and attempted to disguise it as something beyond his control. The mask of innocence was gone, replaced by the reality of guilt. For the community, the case became a haunting reminder of how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary of faces, how trust can be shattered by the person closest to you. Connie's death was no accident, no random act of violence, but the devastating result of betrayal carried out with cold precision.